You've lived your entire life with the benefits of fire. But if you were stranded in the wild without matches, could you make one? Could you make one if your life depended on it? Well, it can't be that hard. I mean, if a bunch of cavemen figured it out, then a modern, sophisticated guy like me should have no problems, right? Right? So how did a bunch of club-wielding Neanderthals figure out how to light one? Well, we don't really know. The evidence is pretty thin. But if we try to recreate the experience for ourselves, we can tell a story that is consistent with what little evidence we have. So let's try it. Imagine yourself living in a small band on the ancient savannas of Africa. Before you can think about making or even controlling fire, there's a bunch of hurdles that you have to pass first. You've got to be comfortable getting up close and personal with this thing that can burn you to a crisp. And you've got to somehow come to see fire as a tool that you can use. This probably took a wicked long time. Humans probably lived with fire for millions of years before they tried to control it. And in that time, they may have gradually learned to shelter from predators near the flames, or huddle near the embers for warmth, or forage for the accidentally cooked seeds and tubers and even animals that were left in its wake. So even back a long time ago, fire was useful, but not dependable. A lightning strike might set the grasses ablaze, and then it goes out, and you're back to gnawing on tough roots and raw meat. But what if you could keep it going just a little bit longer? This might have seemed a very interesting question on a night when the lions were getting close. Today, it might seem obvious to us that fires need fuel. But that knowledge isn't instinct. Somebody had to have the stroke of insight that putting some unburned wood onto the flames would make them last longer. But even then, the path to keeping a fire going was not straightforward. You throw a big log onto some old embers, and it does not catch. Scatter some sticks on the hot coals, and they might burn, but it won't last. Add a heap of wood to your fire all at once, and you've smothered it. Any scoutmaster has seen modern-day novices make these mistakes over and over again. It turns out that keeping a fire alive is a subtle art, full of lots of different little techniques, each one of which needs to be discovered and learned and taught. For hundreds of thousands of years before anyone learned to make fire, people were just learning to keep them in thousands upon thousands of little steps. By about 400,000 years ago, people had expanded onto continents beyond the African savanna, and they'd taken their knowledge of fire with them. And probably sometimes even the fire itself in these ingenious little tinder-filled pouches. But as humans were expanding out into the world, that world was getting colder. Ice sheets were growing, and the northern latitudes were sinking into an ice age. Imagine that winter is coming, and your last coal just went out. What would you do? Modern, you might think to try and start a fire. But if nobody ever had started one, how could you even imagine the possibility? How would you even have the thought to try? Here's two possibilities. While making a hand axe one day, you strike a piece of flint with an oddly lustrous piece of river stone, and a spray of tiny little hot sparks fly off. Or maybe you're twirling a dried stalk to try and drill a hole in some wood, and then suddenly there's a little puff of smoke. Maybe these things inspire a realization that it might be possible to start your own fire. But even after you realize this, there are dozens of obstacles to overcome. Take the sparks coming off your flint. You can't just smash any two random rocks together. Flint striking only works if you have just the right combination of minerals. And then those sparks you make only last an instant. It turns out that it takes the most flammable tinder for a spark to possibly catch. Indeed, today, people who can start fire with flint and steel, which is much easier, by the way, than starting it with a piece of flint and a chunk of pyrite, they tend to pre-burn pieces of char cloth just for the job of catching that spark. Well, what about that friction fire? Anyone who has tried it will tell you that it is way more complicated than trying to just rub two sticks together. Even with the easiest methods and some expert teachers, it took me many, many hours of practice to get my first one. And without expert help, the obstacles are legion, and you have to figure them all out yourself. First, you have to figure out your materials. Which woods are just the right hardness and just the right strength. Then you have to get the downward pressure of the spindle into the fireboard just right. And then, once you've figured it out, you have to have the strength and the endurance to keep it up for many minutes on end, especially while you're figuring it out. You've got to learn how to hold it just so that the spindle doesn't end up popping out of the fireboard. And if you don't have good technique, which when you're a beginner, you just don't, you get blisters all over your hands. And even when you get smoke with a fire drill, you are so disappointingly far from getting a serviceable coal. Nowadays, if you learn these old methods of fire starting, you'll find out that every expert carves a little notch in the side of their fireboard to collect the hot dust that will eventually become the coal. But if you've never seen anything like that, how do you come up with the idea? Then, assume all of this goes right, you have to recognize the coal when you get one. When I learned, I got coals for days and didn't even know it because they didn't look like the glowing ember that I expected. Only then, when you finally got all of that, can you gather up that little coal and put it in the driest and fluffiest tinder you can find and try to keep your hands and your breath steady as you blow it into flames. I've seen lots of people get their first friction fires, and it is for many of them a life-changing experience. And every time there is this expression of joy and reverence on their faces. I can only imagine the moment of transcendent gratitude that must have accompanied the very first time. Today, practicing the old way of making fire puts us in touch with the deepest human traditions, and it shatters our preconceptions about our ancient ancestors. Being primitive wasn't being dumb. Discovering how to use and make fire took as much insight and determination and collaboration as any iPad or fuel cell. If today we seem really sophisticated, it's not just because we're smart. It's because they were smart. We see far, and we can do much because we stand on their shoulders. It's an inheritance worth our deepest gratitude. And that's what this channel is about.